or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Harriet Gromer Hicks, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the July 26, 2026 issue of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first article is a pre-Pixar proto-Toy Story. The Brave Little Toaster, a hand-drawn film about animate appearances that come to life, was a charming entry before Disney animation kicked off of its resurgence. There's more to stream on Disney Plus, including Pixar's Hoppers, about a popular human beaver activist. The Brave Little Toaster, 1987, produced just before Disney animation kicked off its renaissance with The Little Mermaid in 1989, The Brave Little Toaster feels conspicuously like a low-stakes investment from a studio that was still in the creative wilderness, and that's part of the film's considerable charm as a hand-drawn proto-Toy Story about inanimate appearances that come to life whenever their master, a little boy named Rob, isn't around. In addition to the two-slice toaster, Deanna Oliver, his great electric blanket sidekick, Timothy E. Day, and a desk lamp, Timothy Stack, that looks a lot like Pixar's Luxo Jr. The film also features a brief but memorable turn by Phil Hartman as an angry air conditioner that talks like Jack Nicholson. You'll never look at a window unit the same way again. Hoppers 2026. When a popular big city mayor, John Hamm, wants to build a piece of highway to ease morning commutes, nothing can stand in the way of progress, save maybe an idealistic young activist, Piper Curda, whose consciousness has been meddled with robotic beaver avatar. That sounds like an absurdly convoluted premise for an animated comedy, but Pixar's Hopper swiftly establishes the funny dynamic of the human beaver desperately rallying various pond animals to rebuild their lost eating. Along with its zany metaphysics, the film carries a surprising optimism over both interspecies relationships and municipal compromise. Dragon Striker 2026, revolving around a game that has about as much resemblance to soccer as Quidditch does to rugby. In Harry Potter series, this beautifully animated series centers on a sport where kicking the ball into the net can feel like an apocalyptic endeavor. The lovable underdogs, at its center, a farmer's son and a goalkeeper of extremely marginal power, enroll at Cal Historic Academy, a school that teaches the soccer-like sport of Gorotama to students who have the magical potential, or Tama, to manipulate the field of play. Though it comes from French production company, Dragon Striker has the look and feel of anime, giving the personalities of each character an outsized visual punch. The Punisher, One Last Kill, 2026. Parents who associate the Marvel label with noble bloodness superhero adventures should know to mind the TVMA rating on the Punisher TV series. And that holds doubly true of this 45-minute special. A no-holds-barred gore fest that feels like a fusion between 1980s inner city revenge thriller and a Hong Kong action movie, co-written by its charismatic star John Bernthal. The Punisher One Last Kill takes place in New York's Little Sicily, which is still overrun by crime, most of the Nucci mob family. Despite the lingering trauma of past violence, Castle summons the energy to rebuff an attack on an apartment complex, even with his paints quite literally on fire. Avatar: Fire and Ash, 2025. Expanding into its second sequel and counting, James Cameron's Avatar movies have become his Star Wars, an exercise in world building where the digital marvels of the planet Pandora have become more compelling than the characters within them. But there's plenty of gawk at Avatar: Fire and Ash. At 197 minutes, the longest of the three movies by far, which naturally segues from the aquatic setting of Avatar: The Way of Water by pitting Jake Sully, Sam Worthington, Neytiri Zoe Saldana, and their family against a warmongering, naive fire clan called the Matikana. If you fell for the earlier two movies, our critic Madoha Dagres predicted you will likely succumb to this one's visual charms. Our next article is in the headliner. Lindsay Hubbard keeps it long distance. My 10. For 10 seasons, viewers have watched Lindsay Hubbard and her summer house castmates travel to the Hamptons to throw over-the-top parties, host catered dinners, and look up with one another. But now, Hubbard is forging her own path. In the city premiered this spring on Bravo and focused on Hubbard and her real-life New York City friend group. They entered new life phases. For Hubbard, the next chapter was welcoming a daughter in 2024. As a single mother now, her hope is to show viewers that life doesn't end when you become a parent. There are just different considerations. I can no longer just date for fun, or I can. In a Rockefeller Center conference room, Hubbard discusses her likes and loves. These are edited excerpts. Number 1, my daughter, Gemma. She is the biggest light in my life. She is such a fun energy. She is vibrant and so excited. She loves to tackle people, but then give them a hug and a kiss, which is pretty much me. Number 2, the beach. I grew up in Florida and grew up fishing on a boat with my parents pretty much my whole life. I just love the sunshine, the vitamin D. Give me a beach and I am the happiest girl in the world. Number 3, sandwiches. There's just no shortage of my love for sandwiches, and it's pretty much my lunch every single day. I love an Italian sandwich. I love a Cuban. I love a roast beef sandwich with a little aioli. Number 4, dancing behind the DJ booth. I've always been the hype girl. Dancing is very much so an outlet to relieve stress for me. It just is my way for exorcising the demons out of my body, and especially when Kyle Cook is DJing, he's a fun DJ. Number 5, long-distance boyfriends. I do have suitors at the moment. However, they're long distance and I'm really enjoying that. They won't bother me. Pretty much 100% of my time is dedicated to being a mom and work. I don't have time to go out and meet guys. Number 6, my Nespresso. The second I wake up, I need coffee. I have a Nespresso home. Carl Redick of Summer House, I got it for me for our first Christmas together. I've kept it ever since. Number 7, breath fresheners. Almost everything I do these days, I'm interacting with people. I either have to have the Listerine strips that melt in your tongue or the spray, and I just go around spraying everyone. Number 8, Archipelago hand cream. Out of everything on my body, my hands get the driest. So I carried the Archipelago soy milk hand cream on me at all times. I've been using this for upward of, 12 years. Number 9, admin days to cross off my to-do lists. Very much needed and necessary. Otherwise, things build up and then you're stressed out and the to-do list grows. Number 10, girls' nights in, wine included. Going through a breakup, co-parenting, and filming 2 back-to-back shows all in the year I became a mom, that leaves very little time. I also just really enjoy not putting makeup on when I don't have to. So I'll get the wine, you get to my house. Our next article, scandals that build in prolonged telling. Podcasts are an ideal medium for investigative journalism, allowing for an in-depth storytelling. These 6 are some of the best in the genre, combining retrospective interviews and new reporting to build suspense, explore stories of corruption and institutional wrongdoing, and forge an emotional connection between the listener and the people affected. Believed, a co-production of NPR and Michigan Radio, Believed explores how Larry Nassar, the former doctor for USA Gymnastics, was able to sexually abuse hundreds of women and girls over more than 2 decades. Despite numerous complaints and how survivors brought him to justice, the hosts are Kate Wells and Lindsay Smith, veteran Michigan radio journalists whose empathetic reporting and deep knowledge of their subject anchor an often harrowing history. Starter episode, The Good Guy. Bagman. While the nation was transfixed by Watergate in 1973, young federal prosecutors in Baltimore were quietly uncovering a corruption scandal that would also reshape Richard M. Nixon's presidency. Hosted by Rachel Maddow, Bagman chronicles how Vice President Spiro T. Agnew accepted kickbacks during this time in local, state, and federal office. Shedding light on an often overlooked history, the podcast makes a complex saga digestible and entertaining. It also highlights how Agnew's confrontational tactics and anti-elite messaging created a blueprint for today's grievance-driven policies. Starter episode, An Unsettling Secret. Headlong running from cops. Dan Taberski, a former producer for The Daily Show, began the documentary podcast Headlong in 2017 with a popular but controversial season titled Missing Richard Simmons. Though there would seem to be a little in common between that subject and the focus of the podcast's 3rd season, the long-running reality show Cops, there is a connection. Both explore the darker side of beloved cultural phenomena. 6 episodes delve into the stories of people whose arrests were broadcast nationally and who were often asked to sign releases while intoxicated or in highly vulnerable state. Running from Cops also examines how the close relationship between the show's producers and the police departments could reinforce stereotypes and tip into what critics call propaganda. Starter episode: The One-Celled Amoeba. Shadow World Impulsive. This podcast from the BBC showcases compelling stories from the shadows, which have included grave robberies, museum heists, and miscarriages of justice. Its most recent season explores the behavioral side effects of dopamine-agonist drugs commonly prescribed for Parkinson's disease. 10 episodes chronicle stories of patients who underwent often devastating personality changes. A retired teacher who has lost his life's fortune to romance scams, a young woman who developed a gambling addiction out of the blue, and a respected lawyer who ended up in prison for fraud. Noel Thatchridge, an investigative journalist for the BBC, examines evidence that drug companies were aware of the risks for the serious impulse control side effects for many years before morning were addicted. Impulsive also leaves listeners with haunting question: just how much of human personality comes down to chemistry? Starter episode: Warning Signs. Brainwashed. During the Cold War, paranoia about the threat of Soviet brainwashing drove the CIA to develop inhumane and illegal mind control experiments for use on unwitting subjects. This atmospheric and often chilling podcast from the Canadian Broadcast Corporation homes in the Allen Memorial Institute, a psychiatric hospital in Montreal whose lofty reputation during the 1950s belied its true nature as a covert outpost for the CIA's experiments. The first episode picks up with Michelle Shepard, an independent investigative reporter, paying a visit alongside Alan Tanney, whose father, Charles, was subjected to treatments that left him a shell of his former self. Brainwash combines contemporary reporting with archival audio to tell the stories of patients who underwent experiments involving LSD, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation, as well as their families' fight for justice. Starter episode is Raven Scrag. Bed of Lives. Each season of this podcast from The Telegraph focuses on a story of institutional deception, abuse of power, and corruption in Britain. The first season dealt with the Spy Cop scandal, in which undercover officers from the Metropolitan Police Force, London infiltrated activist groups, and formed long-term intimate relationships with women under false identities. Kara McGogan, the Telegraph's first narrative audio journalist, spotlights 4 victims who describe how they were seduced and manipulated. A later season explores the decades-long contaminated blood scandal, during which thousands of Britons were infected with incurable diseases by way of blood transfusion. Another delves into the supposed collusion between the British state and loyalist parliamentaries in Northern Ireland. Starter episode: Infiltration. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Arts and Leisure section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our next article is under Classical. Nothing deters Wagner's opera fans. For 150 years, the Bayreuth festival has drawn complaints, but pilgrims continue to endure much for music. The first time I went to the Bayreuth Festival, that hallowed temple of Wagnerian opera, I nearly panicked just taking my seat. My ticket was for a spot in the middle of the auditorium, which is wide with no center aisle. The late July sun and the lack of air conditioning in small town Germany already had me overheating in my suit and tie, and it was clear that I would have to tuck my shoulders and slightly hunch to fit in the tight space allotted each guest. If I needed to escape for fresh air, I would have to get past more than 25 people on either side. But before I could figure out how that would even work, the ushers closed the doors and locked us in. The theater's lights darkened, and the buzz of audience chatter fell to silence. Within this seeming void, a glinting major chord that opens Lohengrin emerged from the hidden orchestra pit like vapor, rising up the steep rake of the auditorium and seeming to hover around my head. A perfumed enchantment just for me. I had never heard anything like it. There's a version of this story that ends there under the spell of great art, like Ruskin before the Tintorettos of Venice, and I wouldn't be alone. People have been describing the near-religious acoustic experience of Bayreuth pronounced by Riot since its inauguration 150 years ago. His summer with the premiere of Wagner's four-opera epic, Der Ring des Nibelungen. But the truth is, by the end of Act 1 of the Lohengrin, my butt hurt from the theater's wooden seats and my sweaty shirt clung to my back. The air outside was warmer, but mercifully less stagnant. I had to stand in a long line each break for an opportunity to buy and chug an enormous bottle of water. Before taking my seat, I splashed my face at a sink in a subterranean bathroom, and I dried off with a paper towel from steel-lined and toilet entrefou. At the end of the night, I gathered my tie and suit jacket, which I had shed, abandoning decorum, and followed an exodus down the green hill. I rode a bicycle to the center of Bayreuth, where I was renting a room from a night nurse whose cat oppressively cuddled me through the night, heating my body as I tried to cool it down with wet, refrigerated washcloths. I couldn't say I was happy. Yet I woke up and did it all over again for Parisville, then again for Die Meisinger von Nuremberg. I went back the next year and have kept going since. At this point, I have seen all 10 Wagner operas that make up the Bayreuth canon. Each time I dread the trip. Each time I leave in some degree of awe. And that may always be the case. People have been complaining about the returning of this festival from the start. So why does it still have each hold on us? Remarkably, little has changed about the Bayreuth Festival since its founding. It was the first musical pilgrimage of its kind, and Wagner's fans knew it would be monumental. He had built an entire theater for the sole purpose of staging his Ring, and his endeavor attracted fans including royalty from around the world. Tchaikovsky wrote articles about it throughout the year, declaring months in advance that Bayreuth was surely fated to become a milestone, marking one of the most interesting epochs in the history of art and bound to leave behind a blazing trail in history. The New York Times regularly published front-page articles about the festival, including a detailed analysis of the Ring. One article in 1876 observed Bayreuth as a media revolution, saying it was the first time a performance in one hemisphere could be viewed the next day in another, because readers were so eager to read about it. The Times predicted a future in which we shall record and judge the production of an opera in another planet, or that very music of the spheres may be audible and so, of course, criticizable. When the pilgrims arrived in Bayreuth, though, they weren't met with much beyond the music. Wagner liked the town because it didn't have anything to compare with his ambitions. It was isolated and without a spa or a major theater. He could command the full attention of his audience. What he didn't consider, it seemed, was whether Bayreuth had lodging and restaurants to support the sudden influx of travelers. One correspondent wrote that Bayreuth had 3 or 4 inns, but added, "I cannot bring myself to speak of any one of them as a hotel." Mark Twain, who would visit it in 1891, wrote an irrelevant essay at the shrine of St. Wagner that the town is littered with restaurants, but they are small and bad. Tchaikovsky struggled to find a piece of bread. He met a very high-ranking figure in Russia who didn't have lunch the whole trip. All she had to nourish herself, she told him, was coffee. Because the Festival Theater had been under construction since 1872, and because Wagner lived in Bayreuth with his family at a villa named Wanfried, the town was already loaded with memorabilia. A front-page article in the Times described purses, cigar cases, canes, and more that had been fashioned in his likeness. There was even a cigar pipe with a bowl made to look like a bust of Wagner. Today, you're just as likely to be in search of decent meal and a pleasant night's sleep, and just as likely to be inundated with Wagner Arena. Streets in Bayreuth are named after characters in his operas. There is one intersection where Sigmund Strauss meets Hundred's Strauss, a city planning nod of their clash in Die Wilker. I have stayed at the Hotel Ringgold, almost good air conditioning, past a jeweler with a sale sign that says D Ring up to 50% off, and ordered a cafe's Gothenburg Burger, breakfast, eggs with flame red peppers. The theater sits atop what is known as the Green Hill, a leafy campus about a half-hour's walk from the city center. Because performances start in the afternoon with recommended arrival time of 3 p.m., people don't come by car, are made to hike the slope in gowns and suits, with little protection from the midday sun. According to a Times account from 1876, audience members who couldn't secure one of a few carriages trudged overheated, choked with dust, and disposed already to grumble at everybody and everything. Wagner's theater, though, was deemed worthy the journey. From the outside, it was ugly, often compared to a barn or beer tent. In that harmonic union of all the arts which Wagner aspires to, architecture has been allotted a far too modest place. Tchaikovsky equipped, but inside it was revolutionary miracle. Everything was designed in service of the drama. The orchestra pit was hidden, covered by hoods from which the sound snakes out and into the auditorium, completely balanced as if controlled by a soundboard. The stage was behind 2 proscenium layers, created a telescope effect that made the singers look smaller and the set grander. because the lights would be turned off during performances, something that wasn't yet standard practice. The view was closer to that of a cinema. Most important, the house's amphitheater design and absence of boxes meant the stage would be visible from every seat. George Bernard Shaw wrote in The Perfect Wagnerite was the audience pageantry of an opera performance. The sightseeing globetrotter no longer crowds out genuine disciple. The Ring wasn't a hit with audience at first, but it wasn't the artwork of the future, as Wagner would say. Then the experience of Bayreuth theater was at least the future of opera as we know it. The theater's mystique hasn't diminished. Wagner wrote his final opera, Parsifal, with its sound in mind and initially didn't allow it to be performed elsewhere, demanding a pilgrimage for the privilege of hearing it. The premiere attracted a global audience, including enough Americans to warrant notice in the Times. When Twain made the journey, he was so indifferent. He felt like a hierarch in heaven, but he was in awe of the festival's culture. The famous Bayreuther Geist, or Bayreuth spirit, of an unspoken collective agreement of experienced opera in absolute sense of respect. I have never, he wrote, seen anything so great and fine and real as this devotion. It is a devotion that persists despite the miseries of Bayreuth, as a distinction somewhere on a hike up the green hill. The town's faults fade away. Inside the theater, you can ignore the cramped wooden seats for a little while, knowing that the acoustic effect of wood is part of what makes the auditorium one of the finest in the world. There is, in the end, no better place to hear Wagner. After Wagner died in 1883, his widow, Cosima, moved quickly to her and their son, Siegfried, to be his legal heirs entitled to the festival. It has been run by a family member ever since. The daughter of Liszt and disciple of her husband's work, she solidified the Bayreuth canon, directing shows herself, but then reviving the old-fashioned productions until they were threadbare. Hitler adopted Bayreuth, which for better or worse was always a beacon of nationalism. As a heaven during his rise and rule, he visited Wanfried regularly, even at the height of World War II. Siegfried's sons, Wieland and Wolfgang, called him Uncle Wolf. The festival emerged from the war tainted by its association with the Third Reich and had little budget to rebuild. When it reopened in 1951, Wieland gave the festival a much-needed reset. He abandoned past aesthetics and ushered in what is known as the new Bayreuth era, with spare stagings that emphasized psychology through suggestive lighting. In their abstraction, these productions were strikingly modern, proving how interpretively elastic Wagner's operas could be. It helped to solidify a standard for how directors approach not only his works, but also the entire opera repertoire. In the new Bayreuth era, the festival also began what may be its finest modern feature, a workshop model in which directors steadily outside the Wagner family, at least, were hired for multiple seasons to tweak their productions with each rival. Patrice Chéreau's centennial staging of The Ring, for example, was revealed and notorious when it was new, but seen as a landmark triumph by its final year. Through all these changes, Bayreuth's pilgrims have remained its constant. Critics keep coming back. Devoted fans still plan their summers around it. And today's world leaders walk the red carpet. Angela Merkel is no longer Germany's chancellor, and even she has continued to show up. Many productions flop, but with a new one promised each summer, you never have to wait long before the festival refreshes itself. Under the leadership of Wolfgang's daughter, Katharina, who is the last Wagner to show interest in running the festival, directors have also tried to channel the composer's ethos of adopting the latest technology on stage, like video, augmented reality, and this year's artificial intelligence. The latest Ring, which opens this week after Wagner's Renzi is presented in the Festival Theater for the first time, won't have a director, it will have a curator. Marcus Lobes, who has said that he will present the 4-opera saga as a showcase of Beirut's history, warts and all, with constant stream of AI-generated imagery on stage. When the production was announced, some Wagnerians couldn't roll their eyes fast enough. It's not the first time the Ring has had its skeptics, but one thing is certain and telling, the entire run is sold out. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Arts and Leisure section on the Naira Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our next article is under theater, turning a stroke into a joke and a show. Off-Broadway, Kat Cohen revisits a life-threatening but funny brush with mortality. Kat Cohen was zipping up the bag she had just packed for a trip to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe when she began to feel ill. Then as she reached for the remote to pause the television, she realized her left arm had stopped working. It was August 2023, and Cohen, a New York comedian with a loyal following, had been preparing to spend several weeks presenting her signature mix of cabaret and stand-up at the annual Performing Arts Showcase in Scotland. Instead, she took an Uber to the emergency room. Cohen, then 31, might have suffered a stroke or something similar, called the transient ischemic attack. Not only that, she had a congenital heart condition, an opening between her heart's upper chambers that needed patching. It had led to the stroke symptoms, apparently the result of a blood clot that bypassed her lungs and blocked blood flow to her brain. Lying in the hospital bed with her boyfriend at her side, Cohen tried to process the news. If my arm stopped moving, she had wondered, what does that mean for the rest of my body? Am I going to be able to be on stage again? The thought of losing that was terrifying. Underneath an upstairs paranoia lurks a smart and driven performer. As questions swirled in her head, one idea took hold. This is going to be great material, she remembered thinking. Cohen has made her name as an exuberant physical performer whose musings about how we live now often feel fresh and specific. But her greatest subject is herself. In her stage shows and comedy specials, Cohen alternates between songs and vignettes on themes like food, sex, and her unsatiable need for attention. One song tells past a life as an old woman who baked crusty bread. Another is about begging to be sent flattering party photos from a friend's phone. Then there is the poems about sharing nude photos of or the inadequacy of cauliflower rice. So it should come as no surprise that she is revisiting her life threatening experience in a one-woman show. Broad Strokes, directed by Alex Timbers at the Lucille Lortel Theater in the West Village. It is her most ambitious work to date. Not only is it her off-Broadway debut after years of performing in clubs and at festivals, but it is also her most cohesive show with a narrative about her brush with mortality. Cohen, whose credits include screen roles in Only Murders in the Building and Sentimental Value, is part of a coherent of comics whose humor deepens in song. Audience have responded to her gameness and unhinged quality she brings to her glamour plus shtick, sharing what others might not admit, experiences she often sings about, acid reflux from pad thigh, how boys never wanted to kiss her as a tween girl, or her desperate desire to attend any and all formal events as a plus one. In a review of Cohen's show, Come For Me, at Joe's Pub, Elizabeth Vantanelli wrote that Cohen's songs pack more delicious hooks than most pop albums. Cohen has been honing her style for about a decade. Alan Cumming met Cohen in 2017 when she was performing at Club Cumming, the East Village spot he co-owns. She stands out for amazing combination. She has attention of seeking and vulnerability, both apparent in equal measures, he wrote in an email. A favorite gag, he added, is when she burped on stage and said, "I literally can't stop creating content." But Cohen's observant hot mess personnel, Billy's a smart, serious-driven performer who thinks deeply about her craft. When we met at West Village Diner in May, Cohen wore her long dark hair down and black eyeliner winged around her seafoam color eyes. Her excitement about her new show was palpable. "It's very pinch me," she said. Broad Strokes traces an arc that begins just before Cohen's medical emergency and continues with an unexpected diagnosis of cardiac catheterization surgery she underwent with physician named, incredibly, Dr. Love, and her recovery. In Cohen's hands, the tale is lighthearted. I'm obsessed with juxtaposition of something brash and grotesque and humiliating with something completely heartfelt and embarrassing and real, Cohen said. That's the core of what I like to do. Last summer, she returned to Edinburgh, where she presented a version of Broad Strokes. At one point during a performance, the paramedics had to be called, but not for Cohen. An audience member had fainted when she started describing her catheterization procedure, which involved the insertion of a needle into a vein in her groin. Two more fainted at later performances around the same moment. I'm still trying to iron out the kinks of the show, and people are being wheeled off, Cohen said. Obviously, it kills the vibe. Raised in Houston by parents who worked in law and business, Cohen grew up listening to Stephen Sondheim and Britney Spears. One of her two younger brothers, Billy, is an ensemble member in Ragtime on Broadway. Cohen attended Princeton University, where she studied English literature with a focus on 20th century American poetry. She also took theater classes and sang in a cappella group. Cohen continues to write and perform poetry, which is often ribald and characteristically self-deprecating. At times, it's transcendent. You're surprised when I tell you I pray, but I like the idea of wanting something all the way into space, reads one poem in her 2021 collection, God, I Feel Modern Tonight. After graduating, she got an apartment with fellow young creatives in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and worked as a nanny in restaurants and even as an SAT tutor while taking improv classes at Upright Citizen Brigade and trying out stand-up material. She trained with voice-over coach Maria Curbin, who helped her land commercial work and became a mentor and surrogate New York grandmother. Cohen said, after Curbin died in 2021, Cohen got a tattoo of a martini glass in her honor. Cohen has particular way with language of sometimes rolling words around in her mouth so that they came out buoyant. I am absolutely slurped into this sequin jumpsuit, she exclaims in her special Come For Me before imitating the crack of a whip. The first time the comedian and writer Pat Regan saw Cohen on stage in 2017, I remember laughing so hard it hurt. He said, one of the songs she performed about being intimidated by fit moms in Equonics was an earworm for 4 years, he said. In 2018, Cohen and Regan started recording a podcast, Seek Treatment, which recently released its 500th episode. It plumbs the depth of its co-hosts' personal lives and pop culture opinions and welcomes guests like the comedians Caleb Kirian and John Early. Its appeal is niche. Cohen and Regan, who now lives in Los Angeles, have a long-running bit. The podcast has only 30 listeners. Still, they keep recording, often in a banter that Cohen called her own language. Regan said they both love the feeling of saying something in the funniest way. You just put as much mustard on it as possible. On a scorching afternoon this month, Cohen was hard to work in Times Square rehearsal space. Along with Timbers and the show's music supervisor, Dave Dabin, Cohen considered details like how and when she might cross the stage, on which song lyrics she might lock her microphone back into its stand, and what musical motive ought to accompany a moment in which she relates how the hospital staff shaved her pubic hair before surgery. Timbers, who won a Tony for directing Moulin Rouge, the musical, contacted Cohen about working together after seeing her 2022 Netflix special, The Twish. She's gorgeous. I felt like I was watching a kindred spirit, he said in an interview. This person similarly feels evangelical about combining stand-up comedy and musical theater. Now Timbers said he has been a first-hand that Cohen brings wit, intelligence, and a sense of danger and mischief for everything she does. Cohen rehearsed a number Normal Girl in which she dramatizes how she spiraled before her surgery, wondering if she would live to ever see her name in lights, or crucially survive to learn how to use an air fryer. For Cohen, there is pathos in playing silly moments off the sincere. Since her recovery from her procedure, she has become engaged to a longtime boyfriend, the actor Brian Mueller, who proposed to her last summer in Scotland. The couple recently adopted a Chihuahua mix named Romeo. For a comedian whose material had once revolved in part around dating woes, her domestic happiness has been seeming of an adjustment, one she had been grateful to make. In an earlier song called The Void, Cohen sings about the bottomless pit of need and yearning. That was before I found out a true void in my heart, she said. Being in love, though, has changed her. I am feeling that the void is less cavernous than it was, she said. These physical things so often are true manifestations of the emotional. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Arts and Leisure section on the Naira Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our last article is in film. Criterion Collection expands its offerings of black cinema, but despite a new vision, the transformation is not over. Ashley Clark bought the first DVD from the Criterion Collection when he was in high school, the 2001 Spike Lee approved edition of Do the Right Thing. Clark couldn't know then that he would come to play a major role in the transformation of the Criterion Collection today. At the time, Lee was one of the few black directors whose work and receiving the curated Criterion treatment, a mark of prestige filmmakers. In fact, a New York Times investigation published in 2021 found that of the 461 directors included by then, only 4 were African American. The Criterion president, Peter Becker, owned up to blind spots and pledged to do better. In the years since, the company has made progress, expanding its physical and streaming catalogs and making institutional changes like his first move, creating the position of curator-director, hiring Clark to fill it. We're just doing the work now, said Clark, who was BAM's director of film programming before landing at Criterion. It's not a shock of Criterion releases a black film. In a recent interview, Becker noted, having done this for so long, people will try if we put them out. I don't think it had quite dawned on us at that. With it comes a responsibility and an opportunity. Since 2020, there has been a curated Black Lives section in the Criterion online store. It currently has 99 DVD entries. These range from Garrett Bradley's 2020 documentary Time to Charles Burnett's singular 1978 Killer of Sheep, which involved a complex years-long accusation. Criterion's website does not indicate when streaming titles come online the way the collection does with DVDs, which are assigned a spine number. And on a Criterion channel, streaming titles are not always exclusive to that platform. They regularly come and go according to rights agreements. When asked for further data, the company's publicist said none was available. Still, the data that does exist shows a steady uptick over the past 6 years. I haven't seen much a major rethink of a cinematic organization major ever. Of a cinematic organization, maybe ever, said Ellen C. Scott, UCLA professor, who focuses on black film history. Since 2020, Criterion's DVD and streaming offerings have become the go-to source of repertory or historical black non-Western cinema, Scott added. While Clark said that the progress was a result of collaborative effort among the colleagues and curator advisory board of experts he set up when he joined the company. It also true that after his arrival, the number of black directors included in the collection on streaming noticeably increased. We just have to feel that the film that we chose is exemplary of its form, Clark explains. That's the guiding principle that unites the things we put out. Scott said she had such a deep respect for the work Ashley has done, adding his curation has introduced a generation of cinephiles and film students to an new vision of cinema, really essential films that have remained outside the white canon. Clark's expansive understanding of what constitutes a black film has been a driving force in his efforts to Criterion. He outlined his philosophy in his recent book, The World of Black Film. In the introduction, Clarke defined cinematic blackness as film that focuses on experiences of black characters. And while he underscores the foundational contributions of black Americans, Clarke, who grew up in the South London with a white mother and a black father and moved to the United States in 2014, writes that he intends for his book to be genuinely global in scope and to make room for links between black people around the world. He wants his work at Criterion to echo this too, Clarke said. Still, there are notable American films now in the collection. Criterion made a deal with Warner Brothers that allowed for the DVD release of a number of titles that Clarke championed in 2019 series. He programmed for BAM, Black 90s, a turning point in American cinema. These included Reginald Houden's hip-hop comedy, House Party. This year, Theodore Witcher's indie romance, Love Jones, in 2022 and 2021, romantic sports drama, Love and Basketball, from the writer-director Gina Prince Bythewood. Speaking to the Times in 2020, Prince Bythewood said that Criterion had never contacted her, that she had been disappointed each month when its coming soon announcements have failed to include black directors. After the Times article, Criterion approached her and released a director-approved 2021 DVD edition of Love Basketball 21 years after its theatrical release. Xanadu Irene Davis, thrilled with the DVD edition of Compensation, her time-shifting love story of a deaf woman and a hearing man, told primarily in American Sign Language and dynamic captioning. Clarke had shown the film in his Black 90 series and championed it for inclusion in the collection. Davis said, in 2021, Criterion DVD streaming and theatrical rights through its releasing arm, Janus Films. But the final DVD version of what Richard Brody of The New Yorker called one of the greatest American independent films ever made required significant negotiation that took years. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 26, 2026 issue of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section. We read from the New York Times Art and Leisure section every Sunday at 3 p.m. Your reader has been Harriet Gromer Hicks. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the re-airing of this morning's Buffalo News. Following that at 6 p.m. is the Buffalo News Viewpoints. Stay tuned for this reading and more throughout the day. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability,